Good evening. This is the Sunday evening service for the North Little Rock Church of Christ, for the Little Rock Church of Christ. Excuse me. I'm Don Patton, and we're talking about Daniel in the lion's den this evening. That's a story familiar to a great many people. A lot of mothers have read that story to their children as they were growing up, but you would be amazed at the story of Daniel that is taught in the seminaries today and in the more liberal textbooks, even in something like Wikipedia. You would think they would, in a familiar story, at least tell a pretty straightforward picture of the story, like what people know is in the book from the storybooks. That's not what they say. For example, modern scholarship agrees that Daniel is a legendary figure. Now, that's just a flat denial of a lot of things, and others in the New Testament that quote from Daniel. The tales are no earlier than the Hellenistic period. We talked about that when we were dealing with the Dead Sea Scrolls, that they will sometimes split Isaiah, for example, so that the part that deals with prophecy is after the exile. And when you find the Dead Sea Scrolls written in pre-exile script, Paleo-Hebrew, then you have a refutation of that idea, though they pay often a little attention to that. But here is standard reference like Wikipedia saying this is not a real story. It's legendary. And of course, there are details of history that Daniel foresaw and prophesied, and that is just not tolerable for those who are going to deny the element of prophecy in Daniel. It goes on to say the visions date from the Maccabean era, which is mid-2nd century BC, just a couple of hundred years or less before Christ, not during the time of Daniel, so that the things that he prophesied about the Hellenistic period happened exactly like he said, but he wrote it much earlier. Let me give you an example of what he wrote that I believe is fulfilled prophecy, I think with good reason. Daniel 9, on the wings of abomination will come one who makes desolate, even until a complete destruction, one that is decreed poured out on the one who makes desolate. And so here is destruction, abomination, desolation that Daniel is mentioning. Those phrases are used in at least 4 places in the book of Daniel and quoted by a pretty good source, Jesus Christ himself, in Matthew 24, when he's talking about a destruction, a desolation, that is the destruction of Jerusalem, and warning the Christians that they need to get out of town when they see these indications so that they're not caught in the siege, which killed about 2 million Jews. But he says, therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, quoting there from Daniel, which was spoken through Daniel the prophet. You know, the fairy tale, the tooth fairy, that's not what Jesus is saying, is it? It was spoken through Daniel the prophet. Then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains. Then there will be a great tribulation. You don't want to get caught in Jerusalem with the gates locked. You need to flee and get out of town and go to the mountains. Great tribulation, 2 million Jews killed. But Jesus said this is what Daniel said. He was a prophet. He was real. And if you believe Wikipedia, you can't believe Jesus Christ. Jesus is effectively denied as a credible source by Wikipedia. And so that needs to be taken with more than a grain of salt. That's just fancy, technical Arkansas word. Hogwash is a good description of what you find in Wikipedia regarding Daniel. Let's look at the story as it's told. Much of it would be familiar. Daniel was taken captive by the Babylonians, carried into Babylon, and as a teenager confronted with temptations in Babylon to compromise his religion. Of course, there were dietary laws peculiar to the Jewish nation that God gave to the Jews. They couldn't eat certain meats and various restrictions. And here is Daniel. He's off by himself. Parents are back home. In fact, it's difficult to imagine the impact of the forces that were confronting Daniel. Our young people think it's really upsetting when they have to stay home. They can't go to school. They can't visit their friends. Daniel's whole world was gone. The Jewish nation was centered there in Jerusalem and the temple, and this was all about who the Jews were. And that's gone, destroyed, and carried captive by the foreigners who destroyed Jerusalem and the temple. The nation appeared to be gone, the center of their religion gone. His parents, who knows? He separated from them and they're left. He's confronted now with a new nation, a new religion in that nation. And no one is watching. Parents are nowhere around. Who would know? So what is Daniel going to do? Daniel made up his mind that he would not defile himself with the king's choice food or with the wine which he drank. So he sought permission from the commander of the officials. Now, he didn't stage a rebellion, march around with protest signs. He was respectful. He asked permission that he might not defile himself, and of course was successful in that. He approached it wisely, and they conceded. This is a courageous teenager. Nobody's watching, but he does what he ought to do anyway. Now, particular restrictions that Daniel was obligated to observe are not in observance today, as we're taught in the New Testament, but nevertheless, those laws which are bound on Christians, we ought to treat just like Daniel did with those laws that were bound on him. As a result of his courageous, respectful behavior, wise behavior, he was honored and attained great honor throughout his life. The story begins with the very early part of the captivity and goes all the way to the end, and actually past the time when the Jews went home. But we remember the story early on when Nebuchadnezzar had the dream. He was able to interpret the dream as a future view of four nations, which, by the way, we see fulfilled perfectly, specifically regarding the Roman Empire. In the days of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which will never be destroyed, which we see happening by Christ in the New Testament. In Daniel 2 says, King Nebuchadnezzar, verse 46, fell on his face and did homage to Daniel. Now here's a foreigner, someone who's there as a captive, and you would think, what in the world is going to happen to him? Well, here's what happened to him. He came to be honored by the king, one of the greatest, most powerful monarchs of all time, gave orders to present him an offering and fragrant incense. And so he rose to power, much like Joseph did, whether he was in prison or in Egypt. Through God's providence, was able to use him to serve his purposes. We see that God brought that Babylonian nation to an end. They were a cruel nation, though we see, especially with Daniel's influence, Nebuchadnezzar and other kings influenced and brought to the knowledge of God. But as it neared the end, do you remember Belshazzar in Daniel 5? Not the direct son, but sometimes called the son of Nebuchadnezzar, is now then, as successor, dishonoring God, his father, in quotes, that's finally brought to great respect for God through Daniel. Had to be humbled and become like an animal, eat straw like a grass, but finally came to honor God and respect him. But then his successor ignored all of that. And here is one who is drinking wine from the golden vessels that were taken from the temple in Jerusalem, mocking this God whom his predecessor had honored as the God. And so we read in Daniel 5, verse 30, the same night, Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was slain. Remember the handwriting on the wall, he'd been weighed in the balance, tried and found wanting. Daniel explained all of this to him, and so when that happened, he understood exactly, and it happened just as Daniel said it would. He was slain that night. So this is the fall of Babylon. And God is, of course, preparing to bring his children back home. Verse 30 says, that same night Belshazzar was slain. So Darius the Mede received the kingdom about the age of 62. Now, Darius the Mede was not a Babylonian. The Medes and the Persians had come over and taken over, and his father was Ahasuerus. Now, if you're Bible students, you'll recognize that name, also called Xerxes. This is the husband of Esther, but now we're in the Persian regime. Babylon is gone, or at least in terms of their rule at this point, and now then Darius, the son, well, we don't know it's the son of Esther, there was more than one wife, but the son of the father, we know, of Esther, of the husband of Esther, and he is of the Median descent. Ahasuerus pictured here with Esther and the castle that we've shown, where we have done excavations and where there is a huge inscription from the time of Xerxes, Ahasuerus, who is praising God. This is the translation of that larger than billboard size inscription on this 60-foot cliff there near Van, Turkey today. And Ahura Mazda is the term, the Persian term that was used to refer to God. And which God are they talking about? Well, let's just see what they say and see if you can determine. The great God, the greatest God who created the sky, created the land, created humans, who gave prosperity to humans, and who made Xerxes king and king of many kings. This is Xerxes' inscription that he put in larger than billboard size for everybody to see. That's the father then of Darius that we see now, a major feature here confronting Daniel. He arose to be, and that is, verse 1 goes on to say, I, referring to Michael, the angel, arose to be an encouragement and a protection for him. Now, we find later Cyrus writes the inscription to tell the Jews they can go back home. Isaiah calls him a servant of God. Here is Darius, the son of Xerxes, married to Esther, who is being protected by Michael the angel. One of the misconceptions that I see commonly among even Bible students is that God dealt with the Jews and he didn't really care about the rest of the people in the world. That's obviously not the case from several lines of evidence, but here God is dealing with Cyrus, who's called the servant of God, and here is Darius, who is obviously doing God's will to the point that Michael is sent to be an encouragement and a protection for him. So, and of course, in the background of this is the experience that Nebuchadnezzar had learned to honor God, but that's with the Babylonians. In this regime, as with the Babylonian regime, Daniel rises to the top and is successful. It seemed good to Darius to appoint 120 satraps over the kingdom. He's going to reorganize politically this kingdom. And 120 rulers across this great empire. And over them, 3 commissioners, of whom Daniel was one. So he was one of the 3 over the 120 rulers of the nation. That these satraps might be accountable to them, that the king might not suffer loss. He had so managed his affairs that he was one of the 3 and did so well under this regime that he surpassed the others. Verse 3 says, Daniel began distinguishing himself among the commissioners and satraps because he possessed an extraordinary spirit. God gave him wisdom, and he exhibited that and was successful, as Joseph was in Egypt. Now then, this is later on in the history, gone through the Babylonian history, now into the Medo-Persian history. He's probably 80 years of age instead of a teenager at this point. And it's not simple to keep all of the history straight. There was more than one named Darius, which is just so you don't get confused. But it's not an easy history, but it is certainly one that can be sorted out. But he possessed an extraordinary spirit. The king planned to appoint him over the entire kingdom. Not just 3, it's going to be Daniel over everything. Well, the other 2 of these 3 didn't like that. You got people in politics who are saying, I ought to be the one in charge. Never heard of that sort of thing beforehand. The commissioners, satraps, began trying to find grounds of accusation against Daniel in regard to government affairs. Here's a fellow who's doing a great job, and they don't like that. It should be something they appreciate, but no, that's not the case. They're competitors, and politicians fight, and they want to be in the lead. But they could find no grounds of accusation of evidence or corruption, inasmuch as he was faithful, and no negligence or corruption was to be found in him. They tried hard, and they failed, and finally admitted that there's no way to find any basis of accusation. He's been so careful and so wise that there's just no way to do this. And the men said, we will not find any ground of accusation against Daniel unless we find it against him with regard to the law of his God. And the law of his God was different from what most people practiced now under the Medo-Persian Empire. There was respect for God, we see that, but then there were others that they regarded as well. And so this was the chink in the armor, they thought. And so they devise a plan. They go to Darius. And Darius, of course, has great respect for Daniel. He's seen a long history of his service. And these 2 competitors come up and they begin to approach Darius. We've seen flattery. We've seen people who try to get ahead by buttering up the superior. And here flattery and buttering up is the tool that they're using. They're saying, you're just so great and you're so marvelous, king, that we want to honor you in the way that you deserve to be honored. And you should pass a law that says anybody that makes a petition, I mean, often they would appeal to a god or appeal to, but you don't appeal to anybody. You are the great provider. You are the one who is the most benevolent, beneficial king in the world. And so nobody can even ask anybody else for 30 days, just you. And this is the way we want to honor you. Well, you could just see his head swelling, and he's responding to this kind of foolishness in a rather foolish way. Now, O king, establish the injunction, this law that says nobody can appeal to anybody or anything, any god, any person, except you for 30 days. Well, of course, that's going to put Daniel in a tight spot because he continually prays to God. But sign this document so that it may not be changed. And one of the characteristics of the laws of the Medes and the Persians was that you could not change the law once it was written. And so they got him to sign it. Maybe they got him to drinking. I don't know. A lot of that was going on in that regime. But Darius signed the document, the injunction, that said, I'm so great, nobody can appeal to anybody for anything else. I'm the great benevolent provider. And now then, Daniel, who prayed regularly to his God, what's he going to do? The law of the Medes and the Persians that can't be changed says you can't do this. And a part of that injunction was, excuse me, that if you do this during this 30-day period, you'll be thrown into the den of lions. We see the numbers of inscriptions, depictions on the walls that the people in this regime respected the lion. And of course, that's a fierce, powerful creature and became the symbol of the king. And so evidently they had collected them and had zoos like we have today, or something on that order, and kept lion. Well, they had a den, and this is a method of execution that was being used. And Daniel knew that the document was signed. He entered his house, now in the roof chamber. He had windows open toward Jerusalem, and he continued kneeling on his knees 3 times a day and praying, giving thanks before his God, as he had been doing previously. Just as a teenager, he made up his mind he was going to do what God expected him to do, regardless. He wanted to honor the king. He wanted to be respectful, but at this point, you just have to do what you have to do. And he had made up his mind a long time ago. And it continued right up into his 80s from his teenage years. This is the way he lived. He was praying, kneeling 3 times a day, praying toward Jerusalem. And we see that this was a practice, especially under the Old Covenant. David, in Psalm 55, speaks of praying evening and morning and noon. That's 3 times a day. Cry aloud, he shall hear my voice. We see Solomon likewise talking, especially about the direction of the praying. He's establishing the temple. Here's the dedication of that temple. And when Solomon had finished praying his entire prayer, and that is a marvelous prayer. This is Solomon at his greatest. In his supplication to the Lord, he arose from before the altar of the Lord from kneeling on his knees with his hands spread toward heaven. That's, of course, in Jerusalem at the dedication of the temple. And he's praying, continuing there, verse 29. This is an account in 1 Kings 8. You said, my name shall be there, that you shall hear the prayer. And this is Solomon praying. The same event now recorded in 1 Kings. That you hear the prayer which your servant makes toward this place, that is, toward Jerusalem, where they were at the time. So you may hear the supplication of your servant, your people Israel, when they pray toward this place. So that was instituted, certainly at least by the time of Solomon. We see David likewise at least praying 3 times a day. And then Solomon instituting the idea of praying toward Jerusalem now that the temple is established as the center of God's worship. With the Jews pray toward Jerusalem 3 times a day. Well, Daniel knew that, and that was his habit. Maybe that's not exactly a command that you can find, but certainly we see that it is an established custom, and he's following it, and he's not going to be changed by the laws of the kingdom. Christians, of course, don't have that kind of requirement, but we do see 1 Thessalonians 5 that tells Christians they are to pray without ceasing, continually. Now, how often is that? I would think 3 times a day is not enough. I've had some conversations with some of my Muslim friends, and they'll talk about, well, you know, the Muslim religion, we really religious. We pray 5 times a day. And that's true. You are in a Muslim country, and 5 times a day you're going to see them taking time out to pray. And that's a good lesson for some people. They need to look at some of that example. But I just respond, you mean only 5 times a day? We pray without ceasing. In Philippians chapter 4, Paul says, in everything, by prayer and supplication with your thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. In everything, you have an anxious feeling, you have a desire, you have a spirit of thanksgiving, thankfulness. It's an occasion of prayer, and that should come continually. So Daniel understood that. Christians, in a similar way, do as well today. But Daniel didn't hide the fact that he was praying to God. And as he understood and as had been planned, he got caught. These men came by agreement and found Daniel making petition and supplication before his God, which the law says you can't do for 30 days or get thrown into the lion's den. And he did, and they found him. So they brought this before the king. Now, isn't that a surprise? They come running. Look what we found. They approached and before they spoke to the king about the king's injunction. Did you not sign an injunction? Any man who makes a petition to any god or man besides you, O king, 30 days, he cast into the lion's den. Here's Daniel. He's doing it. You made the law, and so they're springing the trap. I won't get political, but we can just scratch our heads and think, wow, you know, this has been going on a long time. Traps laid, and people get caught in traps that are sprung. Daniel is an example. They answered and spoke before the king. Daniel is one who is one of the exiles from Judah. Pays no attention to you, O king. He does. Now, the idea he doesn't pay attention is obviously a lie, and the king knew that. But he knew also that he honored God and he wasn't going to stop. Anyway, you signed it, but he keeps making his petition 3 times a day, and so they've got the king over the barrel. He likes Daniel. This is one of his favorites, but now then he has made a foolish law, and he can't change it. As soon as the king heard the statement, he was deeply distressed, set his mind on delivering Daniel. Got to be a way to get around this, but the law of the Medes and Persians was in stone. It was one of the characteristics that they seemed to be very proud of. Once it was written, it could not be changed. Daniel, until sunset, kept exerting himself to rescue him, but he could not find a way to do it. Men came by agreement to the king and said, "Recognize, O king, it is a law, the Medes and Persians, no injunction or statute which the king establishes may be changed." They were turned into screws. They were not going to let the king get by. And so the king yielded, contrary to what he wanted. But pride was involved, and the law was such that he could not find a way around it. So the king gave orders. Daniel was brought and cast into the lion's den. The king spoke and said to Daniel, "Your God, whom you constantly serve, will himself deliver you." Sounds like he's got confidence in it. He didn't. And it's obvious that he didn't. He was very, very concerned, but he's almost like trying to cheer Daniel up with words that probably not very convincing confidence. We're told in verse 17, a stone was brought, laid over the mouth of the den, and with a ring he sealed it in the sight of the nobles, so that nothing would be changed in regard to Daniel. I'm following the law. He's cast into the lion's den. That big stone is over the mouth. And here's the king's seal on it. It reminds us of another tomb, a tomb that was sealed with a large stone. According to Matthew 27, Pilate said, "You go make it secure, set the guard, and put a seal, the Roman seal, on the stone so that none can escape." Darius was miserable, expressing confidence. God will deliver you, but he didn't have that much confidence. The king went off to his palace and spent the night fasting. I think that's interesting. Here's a, quote, pagan king. Well, they're not as pagan as many of us would like to think. Any king that's not Jewish is pagan. Well, not necessarily. That billboard that Ahasuerus put up there in what's now Bonn, Turkey, doesn't sound like a pagan king. This was one who spent the night fasting. Would our politicians today follow such examples in difficult circumstances? No entertainment was brought to him. His sleep fled from him. He's worried to death. The feigned confidence is not so strong at this point. Then the next day came. He spent the night in the den. The king arose at dawn, the break of day, went in haste to the lion's den. This exhibits his concern and his regard for Daniel. When he had come near to the den to Daniel, he cried out with a troubled voice. The king spoke and said to Daniel, "Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you constantly serve, been able to deliver you from the lions?" Prior to that, he said, "Your God will deliver you." Okay, obviously now he's not so sure, and so he is calling out. It's certainly a possibility, and he's hoping, but there's obvious doubt. Was he able to deliver? And then the voice comes from the den. Daniel spoke to the king. "O king, live forever. My God sent his angel to shut the mouths, and they have not harmed me, insomuch that I was found innocent before him, and also before you, O king. I have committed no crime." He's not saying, "You blankety blank so-and-so, you shouldn't have put me in here." He's not saying, "I'm here in protest to your injustice." He's showing respect for the king who was very concerned and certainly not desirous of the situation that had prevailed. Anxiously awaiting the answer, he says, God sent his angel. He's not harmed me. I'm innocent, and this is a demonstration of the innocence. I certainly have committed no crime. We're reminded of a similar situation that had occurred earlier in history there in Babylon, when the three friends of Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, had been required to bow before the golden idol. It's a very interesting archaeological confirmation of that story that we talked about when we studied Esther. But there was an angel or a supernatural being. I strongly suspect this was Christ who was with them in the furnace, as he was with the Israelites in their wilderness wandering. But God delivered the three Hebrew children, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, from the fiery furnace earlier. And in a similar way, we see that. Nebuchadnezzar responded, said, "Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He sent his angel and delivered his servants who put their trust in him." Well, Nebuchadnezzar was impressed, as he was with Daniel, and after his experience as an animal, led to praise God. But that was the Babylonian regime. Now then, we're under the MEDO PERSIAN regime, and Daniel is delivered. The king was very pleased. Gave orders for Daniel to be taken up out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, no injury whatever was found on him, because he had trusted in his God. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had said, "We don't know whether God will deliver. He may not. They couldn't determine his plans, and God doesn't always pay his bills at the end of the month. Sometimes he waits for judgment. Sometimes he acts out of anger, sometimes out of an intense sense of justice. They felt confident that he would do what was right, and he did deliver them. Here we see Daniel, because he was trusting in his God, he delivered. Today we find ourselves in difficult circumstances, and we don't know what God's plans are. He works through his providence in ways that we don't fully understand, but we know he knows of the plight of his servants, and he will bless according to his wisdom. He does answer prayer. Sometimes the answer is no, or not now, or wait, which are not always the answers that we want. But he hears, and he will deliver and bless those who trust him, as he did with Joseph and Shadrach and Abednego and Daniel. He will with us. And he will also vindicate and sometimes act with vengeance before judgment on those who are wicked, which is what happened with the wicked men who had confronted Daniel, as is so often the case with God in control. Those who devise evil have that evil come back on their own heads. Verse 24 says, the men who had maliciously accused Daniel, they cast them, their children, their wives, into the lion's den, and they had not reached the bottom of the den before the lions overpowered them, crushed all their bones. The contrast in the action, protected with Daniel, but with those who accused Daniel, cast them in and they didn't get to the bottom. The lions ate them. We're reminded of the story in Esther where Haman devised to destroy the Jews, and that came back on his head. They hanged Haman on the gallows he had prepared for Mordecai, and the king's anger subsided. God can accomplish that. He may decide to wait. He may decide to do it now. It will be his decision. It will be the right decision in his time. But we see this happening again and again. Remember in Psalm 7, David said he's dug a pit, hollowed it out, has fallen into the hole which he made. Mischief will return upon his own head. His violence will descend upon his own fate. And likewise, Solomon, Proverbs 1 says, they lie in wait for their own blood. They ambush their own lives. So are the ways of everyone who gains by violence. It takes away the life of its possessions. God knows how, in his providence, to make things work together for good, to bring vengeance on those who enact evil. And all of the injustice in the world will ultimately be resolved in just that way. Some prior to judgment, but all by the judgment. In Daniel 6, verse 25, then Darius the king wrote to all the peoples, the nations, men of every language who were living in the land, may your peace abound. I make a decree that in all the domain of my kingdom men are to fear and tremble before the God of Daniel. Similar statement made by Nebuchadnezzar once God took him through the ordeal and he learned. And then his successor, Belshazzar, forgot. And Belshazzar paid the price that same night after the handwriting on the wall. Now then, Darius, who had been protected by Michael the archangel, who was a good person, it would seem. It's obvious. But in a weak moment, he made a foolish decision, anxiously awaited and saw God bring vindication to his servant. And so he makes a decree. Now, this is not a decree by a king in Israel or a king in Judah. Kings in Israel, like Ahab, made a decree. Worship Baal. This is Darius the Mede, and he's issuing a decree. Pagan, well, I think that's the wrong term. Fear and tremble before the God of Daniel is the official decree of the king of the Medes and the Persians. He is the living God. Sounds like that billboard that we see from Ahasuerus, his father. The living God, enduring forever. His kingdom will be one which will not be destroyed. His dominion will be forever. That's an amazing statement from the king of the Medes and the Persians. He delivers and rescues, performs signs and wonders in heaven on earth, who has delivered Daniel from the power of the lions. Now that's the kind of honor and respect and praise for God that you see from Amos and from Isaiah and from Daniel, from people throughout the Old Testament. But this is from a king that many would not expect. Sounds like Solomon's prayer. Very similar words. It sounds, again, we would go back to Nebuchadnezzar and look at his words after he had gone through the ordeal. I, Nebuchadnezzar, raised my eyes toward heaven. Reason returned to me. I blessed the Most High, praised and honored him who lives forever, for his dominion is an everlasting dominion. I, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, probably the largest, most powerful king that ever existed. Praise and exalt and honor the King of heaven. All of his works are true. His ways just. He is able to humble those who walk in pride, referring to himself. We see governmental forces, powers, influential people, professors, leaders, who ignore God's law. And the impression we get sometimes is, well, God just not strong enough to overcome this. And here is this overpowering force that weren't as powerful as Nebuchadnezzar or as Darius. And God can turn that around. He did before, he did with Joseph, he did with Nebuchadnezzar, he did with Darius. Don't think he can't do it today. It's time for us to pray for God's power and his wisdom. Pray for our nation and for our leaders, because God does rule in the nations of men. One of the prophecies regarding the nature of the Messiah was he would rule the nations with a rod of iron. And we need to pray that he does that, as Daniel prayed. God hears. And we see a clear demonstration of that with Belshazzar. His son Belshazzar, you've not humbled your heart. And there are certainly national leaders that exhibit such a characteristic. This is the interpretation of the message. That handwriting on the wall was interpreted by Daniel. God has numbered your kingdom, put an end to it. You have been weighed on the scales and found deficient. Your kingdom has been divided, given over to the Medes and the Persians. And he died that night. But of course, God doesn't have that kind of power anymore. You think? Yes, he does. And he's demonstrating that in this story. He listens to prayers as he listened to Daniel's prayer. And he'll listen to ours. In Daniel 5, verse 29, Belshazzar gave orders. After it was too late, somebody come interpret what this hand wrote on the wall. And Daniel did. Told him his kingdom was going to end. Even Belshazzar, who had received God's decree, gave orders, and they clothed Daniel with purple, put a necklace of gold around his neck. Proclamation concerning him that now had authority over the third ruler, as third ruler in the kingdom. The same night, Belshazzar, Chaldean king, was slain. It affected him, it changed his mind, but God was going to go ahead and execute his judgment and usher in another regime. Daniel 6 tells us how Daniel was able to affect all of these kings and to change the course of nations. That is, God did that through Daniel. Daniel began distinguishing himself among the commissioners and satraps because he possessed an extraordinary spirit. That spirit of, I made up my mind, I'm going to serve God, regardless. And he did it all of his life. He was determined, and this wasn't just a spur-of-the-moment decision. From 17 to 80, we see him living that life. That's the extraordinary spirit, the faith, the courage, determination of Daniel. The king planned to appoint him over the entire kingdom. They could find no ground of accusation. That tells you a lot about Daniel. People really, really, really wanted to find something, and they couldn't find anything. The worst they could find was he praying God. And turned that, twisted it, set the trap, but they couldn't find any legitimate basis of accusation. Verse 10 of Daniel 6 says he continued kneeling on his knees and praying 3 times a day, giving thanks. They weren't going to stop him. He was not stoppable as far as his volition and his decisions. as long as the power was in his body, he was going to kneel and pray, no matter what the consequences. The king was very pleased. He gave orders for Daniel to be taken up. He was taken out of the den, and he was given honors over the kingdom. Took him out of the den. There was found nothing whatever was found in him because he trusted in his God. Wouldn't it be wonderful if that could be said of us, those statements? He was courageous. He did exactly what he was supposed to do, no matter what the consequences, no matter what the threats, and no matter how many people tried to find an accusation. And people, that happens. Well, but they said these terrible things about me. You know, they did that about Daniel. They did it about Isaiah. They did it about John the Baptist. They did it to Christ. They did it to Paul. They'll do it to Christians. You rejoice and be exceeding glad, Jesus says. We see good cause for that when we look at the life of Daniel. The story of Daniel in the lion's den is a basis for courage and confidence. They're not just stories for children, but they are for teenagers and for octogenarians. They're for politicians, those in charge of administrative affairs. They're for all Christians. Jesus reminds us, seek first the kingdom of heaven and his righteousness. Daniel reminds us of what that means, to obey God rather than men. We see that stated by Peter as it's before the Sanhedrin. Daniel demonstrated it long ago, and we see it in the New Testament, and we need to see it today, no matter what the threats. Lots of lessons from Daniel that can strengthen us and encourage us. I recommend the book, story, and the idea that it's an illusion, that it's a fairy tale, needs to be exposed for just that. That's hogwash. Jesus thought it was real, that he was a prophet, and I'll stand with Jesus on that. Thank you for listening this evening. We appreciate your attention, tuning in. We hope to have you back with us Wednesday evening when at 7 o'clock we're going to be talking about the scriptural age of the earth. I often have the opportunity to speak on college campuses, usually about the scientific age, and we'll be having that on our TV program, and it'll be on the YouTube channel, dealing with the scriptural, the scientific age. There's powerful evidence scientifically against the billions of years that we hear so often, but also powerful evidence scripturally. And many Bible students you'll hear say, well, the Bible doesn't really say how old the earth is. Well, let's tune in Wednesday evening and we'll see if that's so. We'll study the Bible and yield to whatever it says. Let's end this evening with a word of prayer. We're thankful, Father, for your grace and your mercy. We acknowledge you as the giver of all good things, and we thank you for the privilege that we have to preach your gospel, for the precious souls that are listening, and for the gospel, the truth that you have revealed to us, in which we can have confidence and which breathes courage into our lives and strength and determination to be servants of yours so that we can live with you forever. Bless us, Father, to all these ends in our Savior's name. Amen.